Endocrine system, part 2. Now we're going to talk about the parathyroid glands, and these are 4 to 8 tiny glands embedded in the posterior aspect of the thyroid. Most people have 2 pairs or 4, and they contain these cells called oxyphil cells, functions unknown. I don't know why even put on there. Why bother talking about them if the function's unknown? And parathyroid cells that secrete the parathyroid hormone, which is also abbreviated PTH and also called parathormone. Now, PTH is the most important hormone in calcium homeostasis because this is the one that if you don't take in enough calcium, then it activates the osteoclast to release calcium from the bones and can demineralize the bones. So you have to be careful you get enough calcium in your diet. There's a look at where they're located. This is from the posterior view. There's the esophagus, the pharynx, the trachea is anterior to that, and there's the back posterior view of the thyroid gland with your little pairs of parathyroid glands. And you can see they're more cellular. They don't have the follicles like you find in the thyroid gland. So homeostatic imbalances of PTH, hyperparathyroidism usually is due to a tumor. And too much parathyroid hormone will cause the bones to soften and deform. And the elevated calcium in the bloodstream can depress the nervous system and contribute to the formation of kidney stones. Hypoparathyroidism usually follows trauma to the gland or removal of the thyroid gland or dietary magnesium deficiency, and can result in tetanus, respiratory paralysis, and death due to the lack of calcium, being able to regulate calcium. Now, the adrenal glands are also called suprarenal because they're above the kidneys, and they're paired. They're pyramid-shaped. Like I said, they're on top of the kidneys, and they're actually 2 glands in one. The inner part is called the adrenal medulla. That's nervous tissue and is part of the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal cortex is a glandular type of tissue. It has 3 layers, and it synthesizes and secretes what are called corticosteroids. Now, I want you to keep something in mind. Most of your hormones in the body are protein-based. You only have 2 locations where you make steroid-based hormones, and one of these is the adrenal cortex. The other one is the gonads. The gonads produce testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and here the adrenal cortex is your only other source of steroid-based hormones. Now, the adrenal medulla, the inside, this is the nervous tissue. These are called chromaffin cells that synthesize epinephrine, 80%, and norepinephrine, 20%. There's also some dopamine, and collectively these are called catecholamines. But they're part of the sympathetic effect. They're released into the bloodstream, and they elevate blood pressure. They rev the body up for an emergency response. We collectively call this adrenaline. So it causes vasoconstriction, increasing blood pressure, increasing heart rate, increasing blood glucose levels, and the blood flow is diverted to the brain, heart, and skeletal muscle during an emergency situation. Now, adrenal cortex, there are 3 layers of glandular tissues in the cortex that produce different, what we call corticosteroids. Cortico for the cortex, steroids for the type of chemical that they are, what they biological substance. They are steroids. So the outer layer is called the zona glomerulosa, and that produces mineralocorticoids. So I know these names are a little sketchy, but you'll see a picture in a minute. Zona fasciculata, glucocorticoids. Zona reticularis, gonatocorticoids. This word means like little balls. That's what they look like. This means linear cords, and this means net-like. And when I show you the picture, I'll see where they get the names from. So here's the adrenal gland. They've cut a little chunk out here. There's the capsule on the outside. There's the zona glomerulosa. It looks like little balls. There's your linear cords, the zona fasciculata, and there's the zona reticularis, which is supposed to look net-like. And then in here, this is the adrenal medulla. This is neural tissue that produces, remember, your epinephrine and norepinephrine. So if you come over here to this side of the picture, you'll see that your zona glomerulosa produces something called aldosterone. Now, aldosterone is really important for regulating sodium balance in the body. Works at the kidney tubules and collecting ducts to hold back sodium. That's its job. And when you hold back sodium, you hold back fluid, so that can help to increase blood volume and blood pressure. Cortisol is what's produced in the zona fasciculata. So that's a major hormone that's involved with the stress response too. And you produce it more in the morning than you do in the evening, and it helps to maximize glucose utilization and keeping glucose levels normal in the bloodstream. And under an extreme stress response, more cortisol will cause something called gluconeogenesis, where you start using proteins and fats to create more glucose when you have exhausted all your supplies. So what that can cause is, because you're using proteins, it can really hinder the immune function, hinder the repair processes that are going on in the body and making new proteins and things like that. So the body repairs more slowly, doesn't respond to any type of insult to the body or any type of infection. And so a prolonged stress response can really reduce the body's ability to fight off infection or disease. So that's something that's been widely studied. Spend some time with that, but you want to minimize stress in your life for that reason. Androgens come from the zona reticularis, and primarily the androgen that's important here is testosterone. So they're very similar, they're the same actually as the sex hormones that are produced in the gonads, and the function is really not that important. They don't understand why they're produced a lot, but there is that source there. And we won't really function a lot on those, but I just want you to be aware that they're there. And there's your adrenal medulla with the epinephrine and norepinephrine. So homeostatic imbalances of glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol, hypersecretion of these steroid hormones results in Cushing's syndrome or disease. So because of the effects of cortisol and gluconeogenesis and breaking down the proteins, it depresses cartilage and bone formation, inhibits the inflammatory response. And when we get to chapter 21, you'll see that the inflammatory response is critical in warning the body that there is a problem. The inflammatory response is really like the body's SOS signal. It depresses the immune system, and it disrupts just about every system of the body: cardiovascular, neural, gastrointestinal function. So too much cortisol, a problem. Hyposecretion causes Addison's disease, and that can also involve deficits of your mineralocorticoids, or the one that aldosterone that regulates sodium we were talking about earlier. So you have a decrease in glucose and sodium levels. It can result in weight loss, severe dehydration, and hypotension. And a lot of times when you do have a deficiency in a particular hormone, there's so many synthetic hormones out there now, you can usually get a replacement for everything. But years ago, Addison's disease didn't have a really good prognosis. JFK had Addison's, and they kept it hidden at the time, but some of these diseases would be potentially lethal because they didn't have the replacement hormones at that time. All right, so that takes care of the adrenal cortex. Now we're going to talk about the pancreas. Now the pancreas is a triangular gland that's partially behind the stomach. It has both exocrine and endocrine cells. The exocrine cells are called acinar cells. They produce enzyme-rich juice for digestion, so it's part of the digestive function. We'll talk about them more when we get there. And the pancreatic islets, islets, I've always said islets of Langerhans, contain endocrine cells. Keep in mind, remember this, alpha cells produce glucagon, which is a hyperglycemic hormone, because what it does is it causes cells, it's stored in the liver, glycogen is stored in the liver in between meals, and so when your glucose levels are running down, glucagon is released, and glucagon will cause the breakdown of glycogen to keep glucose levels normal in between meals. Beta cells produce insulin, which has a hypoglycemic effect, and it takes glucose out of the bloodstream and puts it into cells. So after you've eaten a meal, insulin is produced because glucose levels are higher now. They're coming off the digestive tract, and so insulin binds to receptors on cells, glucose receptors, to let the glucose go into the cells. So this one will increase glucose levels in the bloodstream. This one decreases glucose levels in the bloodstream. And this one, glucagon is produced by alpha cells. Insulin is produced by beta cells. There's a look at the pancreatic tissue, and it's just showing you the different population of cells in the pancreatic islet, and then showing you the cells. They just look different, you know, but where they are and what the pancreatic acinar cells look like that are exocrine in function. So insulin and glucagon, they kind of work opposite each other. We call them antagonistic hormones because here's what happens when your blood glucose levels increase after you eat a meal. That causes the pancreas, those beta cells produce insulin, and it stimulates glycogen formation. Glucose goes into glycogen in the liver. Tissue cells take up the glucose, and then glucose levels fall to normal range. And then, in between meals, as the blood glucose levels start to fall, then the pancreas produces glucagon, which stimulates the breakdown of glycogen in the liver to glucose, and then the glucose levels increase and bring the balance back to normal. So that is your antagonistic hormone system and how they work together to keep blood glucose levels normal. Okay, so now we're going to get into the chemistry of hormones. Now there's two main types of hormones. Remember I said you either have protein or you have lipid or steroid. Now your amino acid based hormones, they're either very small, which are amino acid derivatives, or they're a couple amino acids together, they're peptides, or they're more complex, they're larger proteins, but they're amino acid based. Steroids come from cholesterol. And where did I say they're produced? Gonads, adrenal cortex. That's the only place you have them. So it's easier to remember where the steroids are produced, and then everything else is amino acid based or protein. So let's look at some processes. We didn't really talk about how thyroid hormone is produced, but remember we did say the thyroid hormone has to have iodine. So you do have your iodine that gets transported into the cells. Remember, these are follicular cells. Here's your colloid in here. This is the thyroid gland. And see, here's a look at the follicle. There's the cells. These are the follicular cells. So those are those cells right here. And your thyroglobulin that we mentioned earlier is synthesized and discharged into the follicle lumen. So it's produced in the rough ER, transported to the Golgi, and then the Golgi packages it up and ships it out of the cell and puts it here. And then iodine comes in. And iodine is trapped, actively transported in, and then it's iodized into iodine. And then your iodine is attached to tyrosine that's included in the colloid. And that's going to form two different things. One of them is called diiodotyrosine, and that has two iodines, and then you have monoiodotyrosine, and that has one iodine. So you have two iodines with tyrosine, or you have one iodine with tyrosine. Those are packaged up, and two tyrosines will come together. And either you get a 2 plus 2, two of these come together, or one of these and one of these. And if it's got 4 iodines like this one, that's T4. And if it just has 3, that's T3. So these two, T3 and T4, make up most of the thyroxine or thyroid hormone that ends up going out into the bloodstream. So you get this vacuole that contains the hormones with the colloid, and then you get a lysosome that binds to that little vesicle that contains the T3 and T4, and it eats away all the colloid, and then that's going to fuse with the cell membrane and be released into the bloodstream. So there's your T3 and T4. Now you produce a whole lot more T4 than you do T3. And most cells can readily use T3, but you produce a whole lot more T4. And it kind of slows the process down because most cells have the ability to cleave off that excess iodine and convert it into 3T so it can be readily utilized. And remember what thyroid hormone does. It increases metabolic rate, has that calorogenic effect to burn glucose, increase metabolism. So it's really, really important to remember that you don't want this wild fluctuation happening immediately. So having that extra step of cleaving off that iodine, because you do produce a lot more T4 than T3, kind of slows it down so you don't get wild fluctuation in metabolic rate. So that's the production of T3 and T4. Now, your mechanisms of hormone action. There's a couple of ways that hormones have their effect. So hormones act at receptors in one of two ways, depending upon their chemical nature and receptor location. Water-soluble hormones. Remember that the cell membrane is a lipid. So anything that's water-soluble, all amino acid-based hormones except thyroid hormone, they act on the plasma membrane receptors. They're water-based and the membrane is lipid-soluble. So they have to do something to activate a process inside the cell. So they act by way of a G protein second messenger system. They cannot enter the cell because they are water-based. So they have to bind to a receptor on the outside. So those are your protein-based, okay? Amino acid and protein-based, they have a receptor on the cell membrane. They can't get in. Now, mechanisms of hormone action. This is what the hormones do to the target cells. They can alter membrane permeability and or membrane potential by opening or closing ion channels. That's one of the things they can do. They can stimulate the synthesis of enzymes or other proteins. They can turn on enzymes. They can turn them off. They can induce secretory activity, make the cells secrete something, or they can stimulate mitosis. Those are all the things that hormones can do. Now, another mechanism of hormone action is by these steroids we talked about. Now remember, steroids are lipids, right? So lipid-soluble hormones, which steroid hormone and thyroid hormone falls into the same category. This is interesting. I just want to take a little moment here to explain something. Thyroid hormone is not really a lipid, okay? But it is able to get through the cell membrane. It's tyrosine and iodine. It's small and it's able to get through. And that one is kind of the exception to the rule because it is an amino acid-based hormone, but its receptors are inside. So all your steroids, testosterone, cortisol, aldosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and thyroid hormone, they act on intracellular receptors that directly activate genes. They can get in because they're lipid soluble. Okay, so keep that difference in mind. Proteins, not soluble, they have to have a receptor on the outside. Steroids, lipid soluble, their receptors are on the inside. So, intracellular receptors and direct gene activation. This is how steroid hormones and thyroid hormone work. So this is how they work. They diffuse right into the target cells and bind to intracellular receptors inside the cell. That receptor hormone complex goes into the nucleus, binds to a specific region of the DNA in the nucleus, prompts transcription, makes a copy to produce something called a messenger RNA, which is a copy of that portion of the DNA. Then that messenger RNA goes out, leaves the nucleus, goes to a ribosome, and directs protein synthesis. So it carries the message from the nucleus, from the DNA, the message to make a protein. So those proteins that are produced can promote metabolic activities or promote synthesis of structural proteins or proteins for export from the cell. So a lot of different things. Those proteins could be enzymes that carry out activities. So everything happens because of this DNA transcription and then translation into proteins, and then the proteins carry out the effects. So here it is in picture form. There's your steroid hormone, gets through the plasma membrane, it binds to an intracellular receptor, and then that receptor hormone complex goes into the nucleus, and then the receptor hormone complex binds to a specific DNA region. The binding initiates transcription of the gene into messenger RNA. The messenger RNA directs protein synthesis at the ribosomes, and then those proteins carry out the intracellular effects. This little picture here shows you, back to thyroid hormone, T3 and T4, they don't go through the bloodstream by themselves. They have to be carried by a protein, and this protein is called thyroxine binding globulin. And if you ever go and have your thyroid checked and they do a breakdown of all the different aspects of the thyroid hormone and give you a thyroid panel, they usually look at thyroid binding globulin, that's called T uptake, and then you have T3, you have T4, and they look to see how much of each of these you're producing and then how much of the transport molecule that you have. So that thyroxine binding globulin is very important. And then it shows you here the release. T4 isn't readily activated. It has to have an iodine removed. Most cells have the ability to do that. Create the T3. T3 goes to the mitochondrion, causes the creation of ATP. That's your calorogenic effect, burning more glucose to make ATP, and then transcription to produce messenger RNA, and at the ribosomes, protein synthesis, carrying out many various metabolic effects. So that's just a little bit of a better look at thyroxine. Remember, it acts like a steroid because it can get into the cell directly and cause its effect. This is how your protein-based hormones work. Remember, they can't get into the cell, so they have to bind to a receptor on the outside. And when we talked about the way the nervous system works by having direct acting neurotransmitters versus indirect acting neurotransmitters, I had you remember just this one thing. Indirect are slower, and they use G protein coupled receptor pathways. So there's your G protein coupled to a receptor right there. The G protein is blue and the receptor is purple. And when we talked about this in a previous chapter, we said the G protein signaling mechanisms are like a molecular relay race. Here's your hormone passing the baton to the receptor that's going to pass the baton to a G protein that's going to activate an enzyme and create the second messenger. And this is like a little abbreviation of what's happening here. But this gives you an idea. It's kind of like a relay race. So the hormone binds, activates its receptor to release the G protein. The G protein becomes activated by binding GPTP, which is very much like ATP. It just has a different base. And then it goes and binds to a enzyme that's called adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase changes shape, opens up binding sites for ATP. ATP is transformed into something called cyclic AMP, and this is your second messenger. And that cyclic AMP carries out the effects that the receptor, what the hormone wanted to do originally but can't get in, so it depends on a second messenger to carry out those effects. So activating protein kinases, opening up ion channels, causing cellular secretions, all those things are carried out by this cyclic AMP second messenger. So, in order for a target cell to respond, target cells must have specific receptors to which the hormone binds. For example, ACTH receptors are only found on certain cells of the adrenal cortex, but thyroxine receptors are found on nearly all cells of the body. So it just depends on what the hormone is. Target cell activation depends on three factors. How much of it you have in the blood, so the more hormone you have, the more of an effect you're going to have. Relative numbers of receptors on or in target cell, and the affinity, how well that hormone can bind to that receptor. Now, hormones can influence the number of receptors that are found on the cell. Upregulation, if a cell really wants something, like if the cell wants glucose, that cell will put more receptors up there so you can take in more glucose. Downregulations is where if a cell doesn't want to respond to something, it will pull the receptors in exposure to higher levels of that hormone. So what happens with diabetes type 2? People that have had a lot of glucose in their diet over the course of time, some people become more sensitive to that, and their cells start to lose sensitivity for glucose, and they'll pull in their receptors. And so that results in a person maybe being able to produce a lot of insulin, but there's no receptors available for insulin to bind, and so glucose levels remain high, and that insulin resistance results in diabetes type 2. So they've created medications. You've probably heard of metformin, glucophage, that helps to fool the cells to recycle those receptors back up onto the membrane so that insulin can bind and let the glucose into the cells. Some medications you build up a tolerance for because it causes downregulation. Alcohol, people have high tolerance sometimes to alcohol, and so they can drink a lot before it shows an effect on them. There's also some medications that opiate receptors develop a tolerance, so people can take a lot of opiates and they develop a tolerance to that. Also, benzodiazepines, Xanax, Ativan, those types of medications, receptors will pull in, and you can take larger doses of them to produce an effect. So a lot of times addictive processes are developed from a downregulation. So that's just an example. And I'll tell you, this mechanism of upregulation and downregulation is a lot of how they develop pharmaceutical products to make sure that they can get maximum effect of a particular hormone or substance to be used by cells. Trying to fool the cells to put those receptors up there. So interaction of hormones at target cells. You can have more than one hormone acting on the same target cell at the same time. And so when two hormones work together, these are the effects that you can get. Permissiveness is one hormone cannot exert its effect without another hormone being present. We'll see this in the reproductive system, especially with estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen has its effect in the first half of the monthly cycle to cause the uterine lining to cycle up receptors for progesterone, which has its effect in the second half of the monthly cycle to prepare the uterus for implantation and for pregnancy. So estrogen permits progesterone to bind. Synergism is more than one hormone that produces the same effect on the target cell. You see this again in the reproductive system, and this is in the testes, where testosterone and something called androgen binding protein have the same effect in activating spermatogonia to become mature sperm cells, okay? But that will come later on. Now, antagonism, we've seen a couple of examples of this. Calcitonin, PTH. They're antagonistic. They oppose each other. Insulin, glucagon, another pair that's antagonistic. So that ends the endocrine chapter.